Vivian Ashford raised her glass, turned toward the crowd of 200, and smiled as if she had just done something very charming. "This banquet today," she said, her voice as sweet as honey, "is my doing. I prepared it all myself." Behind the kitchen door, Clara Whitmore stood still, her hands clutching her apron, an apron stained with flour, grease, and 3 sleepless nights. No one mentioned her name, no one turned to look. And as laughter erupted in the banquet hall, Clara understood that this wasn't the first time people had eaten her food, but it would be the last time they did so without a price. If you want to know what happens next, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city or country you're watching so I know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss it, because what happens in that kitchen will change everything. The letter came on a Tuesday, which Clara would later remember as the last ordinary day of her life. She was standing at her kitchen table when she opened it, not the grand kitchen of Dawson Ranch, but her own small one, with the cracked window she'd been meaning to fix since October, and the iron stove that smoked when the wind blew wrong. The envelope was heavier than she expected. The paper inside was cream-colored and expensive, the kind of stationery that announced, before you'd read a single word, that it came from people with money. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, you have been recommended to us as a cook of considerable skill. The Dawson Ranch requires the services of a professional for the preparation of a wedding celebration on the 14th of December. The event will host approximately 200 guests. Compensation upon completion of the engagement will be $140. Clara set the letter down on the table. $140. She picked it back up and read it again, as if the number might have changed in the seconds she'd looked away. It hadn't. She sat down slowly in the chair nearest the window and stared at the wall. Outside, the wind was pressing hard against the side of the house. She could hear the loose board on the south corner of the porch lifting and slapping, the same board she'd been telling herself she'd nail down for 3 months. The truth was, she couldn't afford the nails. Not last month. Barely this month either. $140 would cover the mortgage note she owed the Calhoun Bank for the next 8 months. It would buy feed for the 2 horses she had left. It would fix the porch board and the kitchen window, and probably the section of fence along the east pasture that had fallen sideways after the early November ice. It would, in a single stroke, stop the slow collapse she'd been watching happen around her for the better part of 2 years. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She told herself she'd sleep on it. She didn't sleep at all. By 4 in the morning, she was already baking, not because she'd decided anything yet, but because that was what she did when her mind wouldn't settle. She made a pan of cornbread she didn't need, and a pot of bean soup she hadn't planned, and by the time the sky outside began turning from black to gray, she had worked through most of what was bothering her. What was bothering her was simple. She needed the money desperately, and going to Dawson Ranch to earn it would put her in a room full of people who would look at her the way people in Black Willow had been looking at her for 2 years. Like she was less than what she used to be. Like she was something you felt sorry for, if you bothered to feel anything at all. She knew the name Vivian Ashford. Everyone in the territory knew it. Vivian's family owned half the eastern grazing land and a piece of the bank in Sheridan, and Vivian herself had been seen in Black Willow twice in the past year, both times arriving in a carriage and leaving with the particular expression of someone who found everything they'd encountered slightly beneath them. She also knew Caleb Dawson's name, though she'd never spoken to him. He was the kind of man people talked about respectfully. The ranch had been in his family for 30 years. He ran it without hired gunmen or land disputes, and he paid his workers on time. That alone made him unusual. What made him talked about was that he'd been a widower for 6 years and hadn't remarried, and now suddenly there was Vivian Ashford and an engagement and a wedding feast big enough to require a cook brought in from 2 counties over. Clara stood at her stove in the gray pre-dawn and said out loud, to nobody, "It's just a kitchen job." She sent the acceptance letter that morning. But she arrived at Dawson Ranch on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the wedding, driving her own wagon with everything she needed packed in 4 wooden crates. The ranch was larger than she'd imagined. She'd heard it described, but description didn't prepare you for the actual sight of it, the way the main house sat against the hills like it had grown there. The barn and outbuildings spread out below it in a kind of natural order that only came from decades of practical use. A young ranch hand named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 17, helped her unload without being asked to, and showed her where the kitchen was. The kitchen was extraordinary. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment before walking in, taking stock. It was twice the size of the one she'd built in her own house, with a cast iron range that had 8 burners, a prep table that ran the full length of one wall, and storage space that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she had room to work properly. "You're the cook they sent for?" Pete asked, setting down one of her crates. "I am." "Mrs. Ashford already told us about you." Clara turned. "Did she?" "Said to make sure you had everything you needed." He paused. "But also said you weren't to come into the main rooms. I'm just passing that along, ma'am. It's what I was told." Clara looked at him steadily. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I understand," she said. "Thank you, Pete." He nodded and left quickly, and Clara turned back to the kitchen and stood there for a moment in the quiet. Just a kitchen job. She started unpacking her crates. Ikat. Vivian Ashford arrived 2 hours later. Clara heard her before she saw her, the particular sound of boot heels that struck the floor with intentional force, the kind of walking that was meant to announce itself. Clara was at the prep table with her back to the door, reviewing the menu list she'd drafted on the ride over. "You're the woman they brought in." It wasn't a question. Clara turned around. Vivian Ashford was striking in the way that some women managed when they'd had money long enough to wear it naturally. She stood in the kitchen doorway with both hands loose at her sides, and her chin at an angle that suggested she was looking at something slightly below her line of sight, even though she and Clara were nearly the same height. "Clara Whitmore," Claire said. "I was engaged through the correspondence with Mr. Dawson's. I know who hired you." Vivian walked into the kitchen slowly, not toward Clara specifically, just moving through the space the way someone moves through a room they own. "I want to be clear about a few things before you get settled." "All right." Vivian stopped at the far end of the prep table and looked at Clara with the careful attention of someone assessing livestock. "You'll use the side entrance, not the main door." Her voice was even, almost pleasant. "The guests don't need to see kitchen staff moving through the hall." "That's fine." "Meals for the ranch hands go out first before anything for the household. You'll coordinate timing with my personal maid, not directly with me." She paused. "And during the celebration itself, you'll remain in the kitchen. You're not to come out into the main rooms or the yard during the ceremony or the dining hall during the meal service." Clara looked at her. "You want me to cook a feast for 200 people and not be present when it's served?" "I want you to do your job," Vivian said, "which is to cook, not to socialize, not to introduce yourself to guests, not to be seen." She tilted her head, and there was something in the motion that was almost rehearsed. "I'm sure you understand. People like you belong in the kitchen. That's where you do your best work. Isn't that right?" The kitchen was very quiet. Clara could hear the range ticking as it settled, and somewhere outside the sound of Pete crossing the yard. She thought about $140. She thought about the mortgage note and the feed and the east fence and the window that wouldn't close properly. She thought about her daughter, who was staying with a neighbor in town and asking every morning when her mother was coming home. "I understand my job," Clara said. "Good." Vivian moved toward the door. "I'll expect a sample menu by tomorrow morning, and we'll need 3 types of pie. My mother is particular about pie." She left. Clara stood at the prep table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed slowly. Just a kitchen job. She picked up her pencil and went back to her menu list. The first morning, Caleb Dawson came into the kitchen at 5:15. Clara was already at work, which was not unusual for her, but she wasn't expecting company. She turned from the stove when she heard the door and found a tall man in a work coat standing just inside the entrance, looking surprised to find her there. He was older than she'd pictured, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors, not from neglect. His hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like 2 or 3 days. He looked, Clara thought, like a man who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I didn't know you'd be in this early," he said. "I start at 4:30. 4:30. He looked at the stove where she had a pot of broth already going and bread dough resting under a cloth. "Every morning? When I'm working a job this size, yes." He stood there for a moment, not awkwardly exactly, but like someone recalibrating a situation he'd walked into without enough information. Then he crossed to the far end of the room where the coffee sat on a small iron trivet and poured himself a cup. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. "I am." "Caleb Dawson." He turned with the cup. "I should have come and introduced myself yesterday. I was out with the fence crew until dark. Your man Pete showed me everything I needed." "Good." He drank the coffee and looked at the pot on the stove. "What's that?" "Broth base, for the gravy service during the wedding dinner. It has to cook down slowly. You can't rush it." She paused. "I can make you something for breakfast if you'd like." "It won't take long." He shook his head. "No, I didn't come in here to put you to work this early. I just needed the coffee before I head out." He held the cup in both hands and looked at her with a directness she hadn't expected. "How are you finding the kitchen?" "It's a good kitchen," she said honestly. "Best I've worked in." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but close. "My mother designed it. She cooked for 40 years, and she had very particular opinions about where everything should be." "She had good opinions." "She did." He finished the coffee and set the cup down. "If you need anything, supplies, extra hands for the heavy lifting, anything at all, you come to me directly. Not through the household staff, directly." Clara looked at him. "Miss Ashford said to coordinate through her maid." Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "You come to me," he said. "That kitchen is my mother's kitchen. It runs the way the cook needs it to run." He put on his hat and went back out into the dark. Clara stood very still for a moment. Then she turned back to her broth and adjusted the heat and went back to work. She didn't think about him again until the second morning, when he came back. 5:15 again, same coat, same not quite shaved face. This time he looked less surprised to find her there, and he moved to the coffee with the ease of someone who'd been doing this for years. "What's that smell?" he asked. "Cinnamon in the bread dough. I add it to the morning rolls." "You add cinnamon?" "A little. Not enough to taste it outright, just enough to make the kitchen smell like something good is happening." He considered this. "Does it change the flavor?" "No, it changes how people feel when they walk in and smell it, which changes how they taste everything else." He turned and looked at her then, the way you look at someone who just said something you weren't expecting. "That's—" he started. "It's a trick my grandmother taught me," Clara said. "She said cooking was half chemistry and half theater." She was right. "I know." Clara checked her dough. She was right about most things. He sat down on the stool at the end of the prep table, not the chair, just the stool, like a man who was deciding whether to stay or not and hadn't made up his mind yet, and asked her what else her grandmother had taught her. Clara talked while she worked. She didn't usually talk while she worked, but there was something in the way he asked that wasn't idle curiosity or polite chatter. He was actually listening in the particular way of someone who has learned to pay attention because inattention costs them something once. She told him about the canning method her grandmother had developed for summer fruit, and the way you could tell when a pie crust was right not by watching it, but by the sound it made, and the particular combination of spices she used for the beef roast that she'd never written down, because some things needed to stay in muscle memory or they lost something. He listened to all of it. When he finished his coffee, he stood and picked up his hat and then stopped. "You lost your husband," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly heard it somewhere. "A while back." 2 years ago March," Clara said. "I'm sorry." A pause. "I lost mine 6 years ago. My wife." He looked at the hat in his hands. "People say it gets easier. I think what they mean is you get better at carrying it." Clara looked at him. "That's exactly what they mean." He nodded once and went back out. Clara stood in the kitchen in the quiet and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. She felt like herself. Ye sissy. On the 4th day, Vivian Ashford came into the kitchen in the afternoon and watched Clara work for several minutes without speaking. Clara was preparing a trial run of the wedding cake's first 2 layers. She always ran trials on complex baking, and she was at the stage that required her full concentration, so she didn't stop working. She acknowledged Vivian with a nod and kept her hands moving. The ranch hands won't stop talking about the breakfast rolls, Vivian said. They're good rolls, Claire said. It's making the household staff feel like they're not doing enough. Her voice had a particular edge, the kind that was aimed but dressed up as casual. They're saying the kitchen is the best-smelling room on the property. It usually is. Vivian moved further into the kitchen and stopped at the edge of the prep table, close enough that Clara could feel the intention of it. Caleb came in for coffee again this morning, Vivian said, and yesterday, and the day before. Clara kept her eyes on the cake layers. The coffee's here. He doesn't usually come to the kitchen. I couldn't say. I'm saying it. The edge in her voice was closer to the surface now. He has coffee in his study, as a rule. He's been doing it for years. Clara straightened and looked at Vivian directly. Miss Ashford, I am here to cook your wedding feast. That's the job I was hired for, and that's what I'm doing. What Mr. Dawson does with his mornings is not something I have any control over or any interest in. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. You should know, Vivian said quietly, that whatever you think you're doing, it won't go anywhere. Women like you don't end up with men like him. That's just the way things work. I'm not trying to end up anywhere, Clara said. I'm trying to get these cake layers even. Vivian left. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table for a moment, steadying herself. Then she picked up her spatula and went back to the cake. She worked until the light through the kitchen window went from afternoon gold to evening gray, and when she finally stepped back and looked at what she'd made, she thought, this is good work. Not perfect. One layer was a fraction too high on the left side, but good, honest, skilled work that she'd done herself with her own hands in her own time. That was something nobody could walk in and take from her. Not yet. On the 6th morning, Caleb came in and found her crying. She wasn't aware she was doing it until she heard the door and turned, and by then there was no pretending. Her face was wet, and she had flour on her cheek, and she'd been standing at the stove for several minutes, not actually stirring the thing that needed stirring. He stopped inside the door. I'm sorry, she said quickly, turning back to the stove. I'm fine. You don't have to explain. I got a letter from my neighbor. She's watching my daughter while I'm here. She kept her voice level. Sophie woke up sick last night, fever. Not serious, the neighbor says, but how old? 7. He was quiet for a moment. Is there someone with her? A doctor nearby? Dr. Haynes is in town. My neighbor will fetch him if she needs to. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, which deposited more flour on her cheek instead of removing the tears. I know she's fine. When you're not there and something happens, you can go, Caleb said. If you need to go home, you can go. Clara turned around. The wedding is in 2 weeks. I know when the wedding is. I can't leave and come back. There isn't time to. Clara. He said her name in a way that stopped her. Not sharp, not soft, just direct. The money isn't going anywhere. If you need to go check on your daughter, you go. We'll figure out the rest. She looked at him. She's fine, she said, after a moment. My neighbor would tell me if she wasn't. I know she would. She turned back to the stove and picked up the spoon. I just needed a minute. He didn't leave. He poured his coffee and sat on the stool at the end of the prep table and said, Tell me about her. Sophie? Unless there's another daughter. Clara almost laughed. She's stubborn, like her father was. She has her own opinion about everything, and she'll tell you whether you asked or not. She stirred the pot. She decided 2 months ago that she wants to be a horse doctor when she grows up. Not a regular doctor, a horse doctor specifically. A veterinarian. That's the word. She won't use it. She just says horse doctor and looks at you like you're slow if you don't understand immediately what she means. This time he did smile, a small one, but real. She sounds like someone worth getting home to, he said. She is, Clara said. She's the best thing I've ever made. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Better than the rolls, he asked. Don't push it, Clara said. And then she was laughing, actually laughing, the kind that came from somewhere unexpected. And he was laughing too, and for just a few seconds the kitchen felt like the kind of place she'd always wanted to cook in. Not because of the 8-burner stove or the long prep table or the perfect light through the east window. Because someone was in it with her who actually saw her standing there. The laughter didn't last, of course. It never did. Clara knew that even as it was happening, the way you know, somewhere underneath the warmth of a good moment, that good moments are exactly the kind of thing that draws attention. And attention, in her experience, was rarely kind. It was Pete who told her 3 days later what had happened after. He came into the kitchen just before noon with a look on his face that a boy his age shouldn't have to wear, something caught between embarrassment and guilt, and he stood near the door turning his hat in his hands for long enough that Clara finally said, "Whatever it is, just say it. Mrs. Ashford talked to the household staff," he said. "She told them the cook isn't to be engaged in conversation during working hours. Said it was a distraction from the kitchen work." He paused. "She said it specifically about Mr. Dawson, too. That if he comes in for coffee in the morning, nobody's to make a point of it." Clara kept her hands moving. She was breaking down a brisket for the practice run of the wedding's main course, and the knife work required attention, which was useful right now. "She said it that way? About Mr. Dawson specifically?" "She said—" Pete stopped and pressed his mouth together for a moment. "She said anyone encouraging him to spend time in the kitchen was overstepping their position. That a cook's job is the food, not the company." The knife came down clean through the meat. "Thank you, Pete," Clara said. "You can go." He went, still turning his hat, and Clara worked the next cut more slowly than she needed to, thinking through what she was and wasn't going to do about this. The answer, she decided, was nothing. She was going to do nothing because doing something was exactly what Vivian Ashford wanted. The woman wanted her rattled, wanted her to make a mistake, say the wrong thing to the wrong person, give anyone a reason to dismiss her before the job was done. Clara had gotten this far by being harder to rattle than people expected, and she wasn't going to stop now over something that was, at its core, a wealthy woman's insecurity dressed up as authority. Caleb came in the next morning at 5:15. Clara said nothing about what Pete had told her. She poured him his coffee when he reached for the pot and went back to the bread dough she was working and said, "The brisket trial came out better than I expected. I was worried about the fat distribution on the cut they had, but the slow cook fixed it." "How long did you run it?" 14 hours? "Started it before midnight." He looked at her. "You started cooking at midnight." "The trial needed the full cook time to be a real trial." She shrugged. "I slept in the chair by the stove." "Clara, I've slept worse places." She shaped the dough and didn't look at him. "The point is, the timing works. We can start the wedding briskets early on the morning of the 14th, and they'll be ready for the 7 o'clock service." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him deciding whether to say what he was thinking. He had that quality. She'd noticed it in the first 2 days, and it had clarified itself since, of a man who chose his words with intention. Not because he was slow, but because he'd learned the cost of saying things wrong. "She talked to the staff," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not going to discuss Miss Ashford's household instructions with you," Clara said evenly. "That's not my business, and it's not helpful." "It is if those instructions are directed at Caleb." She used his name, which she hadn't done before, and it stopped him. "I'm here to cook a wedding feast. I have 11 days left to do it, and I need all of them. Whatever else is happening in this house isn't something I can afford to get involved in." He looked at the coffee cup in his hands. "All right," he said. He drank his coffee and left, and Clara stood in the kitchen and let out a breath she'd been holding without knowing it, and then she turned back to the bread and worked the dough harder than was strictly necessary. The fact was, she liked him. She'd been trying not to because liking him was the one thing she absolutely could not afford, but there it was. She liked the way he listened without interrupting and asked questions that were actually about what he was asking, not just filler conversation. She liked that he'd offered to let her go home to Sophie without any calculation in his eyes, no weighing of what it would cost him. She liked that he sat on the stool instead of the chair, like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he deserved to be comfortable. But Vivian Ashford was not wrong about one thing. Women like Clara did not end up with men like Caleb Dawson. That wasn't bitterness. That was arithmetic. He was engaged to a woman whose family controlled half the territory's grazing rights. Clara owned a 60-acre ranch that was 2 mortgage payments from belonging to someone else. The world ran on arithmetic, whether you liked it or not. She shaped the last loaf and covered them and went to start on the pastry trials. She had 11 days. She was going to make every one of them count. What she made in those 11 days was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary, though she wouldn't have used that word herself. She would have said she worked hard and things went mostly right, which was her standard accounting for any job she took seriously. But the truth was closer to what one of the older ranch hands, a quiet man named Amos who'd worked the Dawson property for 20 years, said to her on the 8th day when he came to collect the noon meal for the fence crew. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. They all took their hats off in her kitchen, which she hadn't asked for, and still wasn't sure how it had started. And he looked at the pies cooling on the rack, and the 3 kinds of bread she had resting, and the stock simmering, and said, "Ma'am, I have eaten at this ranch for 20 years. I have never in my life been fed the way you feed us." "You're the fence crew," Clara said. "You're working harder than anyone." "That's kind of you to say." He turned his hat in his hands. "My wife used to cook like this. The way it smells, and I don't know how to say it right. It's not just food. It's like someone was paying attention." He stopped, apparently embarrassed by having said that much, and looked at the floor. "I just wanted you to know." Clara looked at him for a moment. "What was your wife's name?" "Ellen." "Tell me what Ellen used to make," Clara said. "Tell me her best thing." He looked up. "What?" "You've got 5 minutes before I need you out of the kitchen. Tell me what Ellen's best dish was." He told her. It was a venison stew with dried apricots that sounded improbable and perfect, and she asked him 3 specific questions about how Ellen had prepared it, and he answered all 3 with the kind of detail that meant he'd watched her cook it more than once and paid attention. When he left with the crew's meal, Clara stood at the prep table for a moment, thinking about Ellen and about the specific loneliness of knowing exactly how someone made a thing and having nobody to make it for anymore. Then she wrote down the venison stew in the margin of her recipe notes and went back to work. Vivian came into the kitchen 4 more times in those 11 days. Each visit followed the same pattern. She arrived without warning, moved through the space in a way that announced ownership, said something designed to establish Clara's place in the hierarchy, and left. The content of what she said varied. The shape of it never did. The 3rd visit was the most direct. Vivian came in on a Thursday afternoon when Clara was in the middle of something that genuinely couldn't be interrupted. The pulled sugar work for the decorative elements of the wedding cake, which required constant attention and a particular temperature that didn't wait for conversation. Clara acknowledged her with a nod and kept working. "I've been hearing things from," Vivian said. Clara said nothing. "From the staff, and from a few of the neighboring ranch wives who heard about the food from their husbands." She paused. "They're saying this is going to be the best wedding feast anyone in the territory has seen in a decade." "I hope so," Clara said. "That's what I'm here for." "Yes." Vivian's voice had the particular quality of a conversation taking a turn. "That's exactly what you're here for, and I want to make sure we're clear on something about the day itself. We've already discussed the arrangements. I want to discuss them again." She moved to the edge of the prep table and stopped. "When guests ask about the food, and they will, because apparently you're creating something worth asking about, the staff will attribute everything to the Ashford family kitchens, to my mother's recipes." Clara's hands didn't stop moving. The sugar required it. "Your mother's recipes," Clara said. "It's a reasonable arrangement. You're compensated for your work. What the guests know about its origin is a household matter." "I see. You don't object?" Clara lifted her eyes briefly from the sugar work. "I'm finishing something that can't be interrupted right now. Can we discuss this when I'm done?" Vivian waited. Clara finished the piece she was working on, set it down with the precision it needed, and then straightened and looked at Vivian directly. "You're asking me," she said, "to agree in advance that the work I do will be credited to someone else. I'm telling you how the household will present the food to guests. That's not the same as asking." "No," Vivian agreed pleasantly. "It isn't." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the horses made a sound in the yard. "The food will speak for itself," Clara said finally, "whatever people are told about where it came from." Vivian looked at her with a small smile that contained everything she needed to say and didn't bother saying. "Good," she said, and left. Clara stood at the prep table until she heard the footsteps disappear down the hall. Then she sat down on the stool, Caleb's stool, and put her hands on her knees and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had decided after the first week that she was finished crying in this kitchen, at least until the job was done. She sat for 3 minutes, counted, and then she stood up and went back to the sugar work. Mug. Caleb didn't come to the kitchen on the 9th or 10th morning. Clara noticed but told herself she didn't, which was a kind of lie she'd gotten practiced at. On the 11th morning, he came back, earlier than usual, closer to 4:30 than 5:15, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept well, which was different from a man who hadn't slept. He poured his coffee and didn't sit on the stool. He stood at the far end of the room with his back to the wall, and Clara, who had learned his postures by now more than she'd intended to, recognized this one as the posture of someone carrying something heavy and deciding whether to put it down. She let him stand there. She worked. She didn't push. After a while, he said, "Her father came yesterday. Mr. Ashford. Gerald Ashford." He said the name the way you say the name of something you're trying to be fair about, even though fairness is costing you. He wants to talk about the eastern fields, the acreage along the creek. He stopped. "That's what this wedding is about, Clara. Not, it was never about." He stopped again. "You don't have to tell me this," she said quietly. "I know." He looked at his coffee. "But I've been standing in my own study for 2 days, and I can't say any of it out loud in there. Everything in that room is something I'm supposed to have figured out already." She turned from the stove and looked at him properly. He looked, she thought, genuinely lost. Not dramatically lost. Not the kind of lost that asked for rescue. Just a man who had been making decisions alone for a long time and had hit a wall he didn't know how to go around. "The eastern fields," she said. "What's in them?" "Water," he said simply. "2 natural springs and the best grazing land in the county. My father spent 15 years improving that acreage. Gerald Ashford has been trying to acquire it for 3. He looked up. "The wedding is the polite version of the same conversation. And if you don't sell? Then the marriage starts on a particular kind of footing." He said it without drama, which made it worse somehow. "Gerald Ashford doesn't lose things he decides he wants. He just finds different ways to get them." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What does Vivian want?" He looked at her. It was the kind of look that contained an answer he wasn't going to say out loud. "I see," Clara said. She's not a bad person," he said, and she could hear him trying to believe it. "She grew up in a particular way. She knows how things are supposed to work, and she does them the way they're supposed to be done." "That's a generous way to put it. It's the most accurate way I've got right now." He set the coffee cup down. "I'm sorry. I came in here and started talking about things that are none of your—" "Stop apologizing," Clara said. "You haven't done anything wrong." He looked at her. "You've been kind," she said, "in a situation where you didn't have to be and it cost you something to be. That's not something you should apologize for." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're the most straightforward person I've met in 2 years," he said. "I don't have the energy for anything else." "That's not—" He almost smiled. "I don't mean it as an insult. I mean, you say what's true. You don't dress it up." "I dress up food," Clara said, "not conversation." This time he did smile, briefly, and it was the kind of smile that changed his face entirely for the 3 seconds it lasted, made him look younger and like someone who had once laughed easily and was still capable of it if the right thing came along. "3 more days," she said, not unkindly. "Then I'll be done and out of your kitchen." "My mother's kitchen," he said. "Your mother's kitchen," Clara agreed. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, "she would have liked the way you use it." He went out before she could answer. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment in the strange, particular silence that follows a door closing on someone you've realized, too late or too early, that you're not indifferent to. Then she went back to the stove, because the stove did not care what she was feeling, and the work was not going to do itself. The day before the wedding, Vivian brought 2 women into the kitchen without warning. They came in the early afternoon. Clara had been expecting the late-day prep work to be the hardest part of this final push, and she was already behind on the bread for the morning service. And Vivian introduced them as her cousin and her cousin's companion, though she didn't give names, which told Clara everything she needed to know about the purpose of this visit. The two women walked through the kitchen the way certain kinds of people walked through places that belonged to other people, touching things, picking things up, setting them down slightly wrong. "This is where it all happens," Vivian was saying, in the voice she used for things she wanted to sound impressed by without actually being impressed. "The woman they brought in has been working around the clock." "It smells wonderful," the cousin said. "It does," Vivian agreed. She turned to Clara with the specific smile that Clara had catalogued by now as the one that meant something was coming. "Clara, could you show my cousin the cake? She's been curious about the design." Clara wiped her hands and uncovered the wedding cake, which she'd assembled that morning and would finish decorating early tomorrow before the service. The cousin stepped forward and looked at it. "Oh, this is beautiful. Is this all your own design?" "Yes," Clara said. The cousin turned to Vivian. "You said your mother had the recipe." There was a small pause, so small that the cousin probably didn't notice it at all. "The recipe, yes," Vivian said smoothly. "Clara has executed it beautifully." Clara covered the cake again and went back to the bread dough. She didn't say anything. She kept her hands moving and her face composed, and she thought about Sophie, who had recovered completely from the fever and would be at the neighboring ranch right now, probably trying to tell the horses what to do. "She's very quiet," the companion said, somewhere behind Clara, in a voice that was intended to carry. "Kitchen work," Vivian said lightly. "You learn to concentrate." The companion said something else that Clara didn't catch, and then both women laughed. Not the way you laugh at something actually funny, but the way you laugh to establish that you are together and something else is separate from you. Clara shaped the bread. She counted the loaves she needed, 12 for the morning service, 8 for the afternoon, 16 for the dinner. She ran the numbers on timing. She thought about the sequence of the next 18 hours and where the pressure points were and what she'd do if one of the ovens ran slow. She did not think about the laughter. When they left, the kitchen felt both emptier and less contaminated than it had for the last 20 minutes, and Clara worked better in the silence. At 7 that evening, Pete came in to tell her the ranch hands wanted to know if there was anything left from the trial run she needed eaten, because the word had spread, and several of them had apparently been thinking about the second brisket trial since Tuesday. Clara looked at the boy. "How many men?" she said. 8, maybe, if they knew it was on offer. She looked at her stores, did a quick count, and made a decision that was probably going to complicate her morning. "Tell them to come in and sit down," she said, "and go find Amos and tell him specifically that I made the apricot venison stew." Pete's face did something complicated and then settled on surprised happiness. "Really?" "Go before I change my mind," Clara said. He went at a speed that was close to running. For the next hour, Clara fed 8 ranch hands at her prep table, which was not what prep tables were for, and she was going to regret the cleanup. And Amos ate 2 full bowls of venison stew and didn't say much but looked at her once with an expression that she thought Ellen would have recognized. It was the best hour she'd spent in 2 weeks. She cleaned up until 11, started the first of the long cook items at midnight, slept in the chair by the stove until 3, and was fully at work again by 3:30. The wedding was in 14 hours. She had never been more ready for anything in her life, and she had never wanted anything to be over as badly as she wanted this to be over. And both of those things were true at exactly the same time, which was the most human feeling she'd had since the letter arrived on a Tuesday and changed everything. The 14th of December arrived the way big days always do, with the same gray pre-dawn light as every other morning, indifferent to what was supposed to happen in it. Clara had been awake since 2:30. Not because she'd planned to be, but because her body had decided that sleep was finished and there was work to be done, which was the same thing that happened before every large event she'd ever cooked for, going back to the first time her mother had let her run the church harvest supper at 16. You could tell yourself to rest. Your hands knew better. By 3, she had the first 2 briskets loaded into the oven, the deep, slow heat she'd set the night before already doing its work. By 4, she had the soup stalks at a steady simmer and the bread dough through its first rise, and punched back down for the second. By 5, she had the pastry shells for the savory tarts crimped and blind baked and cooling on the rack, and the compound butter she'd been preparing in stages for 3 days was ready to come out and temper. Pete showed up at 5:30 looking like he'd tried to sleep and mostly failed. "How many people from the kitchen did she assign you?" Clara asked without turning around. "2 girls from the household. They'll come at 7. He paused. "Mrs. Ashford's maid was supposed to coordinate, but she's already managing something else," Clara finished. "That's fine. I'll run the kitchen. When the girls arrive, send them to me directly and I'll tell them what needs doing." "Yes, ma'am." He stood near the door. "Is there anything—" "Coffee's on the trivet," she said. "Have a cup and then go check that the serving tables in the dining hall are set the way I told the staff yesterday. Centerpieces in the middle, nothing near the edges because there won't be room once the platters go out." He poured himself coffee and went, and Clara kept moving. This was the part she was good at. Not the politics of the house, not the conversations that had too many layers to them, not the careful navigation of who owned what and who answered to whom. This. The pure logistics of feeding 200 people something worth eating, in sequence, at the right temperature, without anything falling apart. This she could do in her sleep, or close enough to it. At 6:15, Caleb came into the kitchen. She heard the door and knew his footstep by now, heavier on the left, a habit she'd noticed in the second week and never mentioned. And she turned briefly. He was already dressed for the day, which was different from his usual work clothes. Dark coat, clean shirt, hair combed back. He looked like himself dressed as a more formal version of himself, which was the best way she could put it. Like the clothes fit, but weren't quite his. "You don't have to be in here," she said. "It's your wedding day." "I know what day it is." He poured his coffee and stood at the far end of the room, and Clara let him stand there because she had too much to track this morning to manage what he was feeling on top of it. After a while he said, "The cake looks right." She'd finished the decorations at 4:30 this morning, the last of the pulled sugar work she'd started 2 days ago. "It should. I've been working on it long enough." "It looks better than right." He was quiet. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough." "Clara saw it?" "Caleb." She set down the ladle she was holding and turned to face him properly, because this conversation needed her full attention even if she didn't have it to spare. "In about 90 minutes, this house is going to have 200 people in it, and I need to be in the right place in my head to feed them all correctly. Whatever you're carrying this morning, I can see you're carrying something. I think you need to find somewhere that isn't this kitchen to put it down." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to push you out," she said more quietly. "I just can't carry it with you today. I don't have the room." Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully name. He nodded once, set the cup down, picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. "Whatever happens today," he said, "what you've done in this kitchen, it mattered. You should know that." He went out before she could answer, which was probably for the best because she wasn't sure what she would have said. She turned back to the stove and thought, for just a moment, about a 60-acre ranch that needed a new fence post and a window that wouldn't close properly in the wind, and then she put all of it behind a door in her mind and locked it. She had work to do. The guests began arriving at 9. Clara knew this not because she could see the front of the house. She was strictly the kitchen, but because the sounds of the property changed. Carriages in the yard, voices multiplying, the shift in air pressure that happens when a building goes from quiet to occupied. Pete ran between the kitchen and the dining hall with the expression of a man who'd been handed more responsibility than he'd asked for and was doing his level best not to drop it. The 2 household girls arrived at 7 as promised. Their names were Ruth and Delia, and they were young, barely out of their teens, and they were nervous in the way young women were nervous when they'd been told something important was happening and their job was not to ruin it. Clara gave them clear tasks, specific instructions, and didn't raise her voice once, which seemed to surprise them. "You don't yell," Delia said at one point, not quite managing to keep the surprise out of her voice. "Yelling makes people stupid," Clara said. "I need you smart today." Delia nodded with the attentiveness of someone writing that down internally, and went back to the pastry shells with renewed focus. By 10, the kitchen had found its rhythm. Clara had been in enough large service situations to know that the rhythm was the thing. The particular pace that let you move fast without rushing, that kept the timing coordinated across multiple dishes without anyone having to stop and calculate. It was the thing hardest to teach and most valuable to have, and this morning it came early and held, which was a mercy. The morning service, coffee, pastries, a cold table of meats and cheeses and preserved fruits, went out between 10 and 11:30 without a single problem. Pete reported back that guests were eating and talking and that several people had already asked about the food. "What did you tell them?" Clara asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just said I'd pass it along." "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." He looked like he wanted to say something else, and then thought better of it and went back out. Clara moved to the next stage of prep. It was around noon when she heard Vivian's voice in the hallway outside the kitchen. Not arguing, not quite. More the sound of a conversation being conducted in the register that meant something was being established, the kind of controlled tone people used when they were making a point they intended to be permanent. Clara couldn't make out the words through the door. She didn't try to. She kept her hands on the work in front of her and kept moving. But Ruth came back from the dining hall 10 minutes later with a look on her face that Clara recognized as the face of someone who'd heard something and was deciding whether to say it. "What?" Clara said. Ruth hesitated. "Mrs. Ashford is telling people the recipes are her mother's." "I know." She's saying she supervised everything, that you were just the hands." Ruth paused. Some of the women were asking specifically about the cake design, because they'd heard there was going to be something remarkable, and Mrs. Ashford told them she'd sketched the design herself. Clara kept stirring the sauce she was working on. "All right." "All right?" Ruth looked at her. "I heard you, Ruth." Clara tasted the sauce, added a small amount of salt, tasted again. "Is the cake getting the reaction it should?" "Ma'am?" "Are people looking at the cake? Are they stopping when they walk past the display table?" Ruth blinked. "Yes, they keep stopping. I heard a woman say she'd never seen anything like it." "Good," Clara said. "That's what matters." Ruth looked at her for a moment with an expression that was partly confusion and partly something that might have been respect, and went back to her task. Clara finished the sauce. She had known, when Vivian said it 3 days ago, "The staff will attribute everything to the Ashford family kitchens," exactly what that meant and exactly what it would look like when it happened. She had chosen to stay anyway, because $140 was $140, and because the work was worth doing regardless of whose name went on it. That was what she told herself. What was also true, underneath that, was that she had hoped, in some quiet part of herself that she hadn't examined too closely, that the food would be enough. That it would be so clearly itself, so unmistakably the product of someone specific and skilled that no amount of redirection would stick. She was still hoping that. She was also burning through the last of what she had to hope with. The ceremony was held outside on the south side of the house, where the ground leveled off and the view extended out to the hills. Claire could hear the gathered crowd from the kitchen. Not words, just the particular sound of 200 people being formally quiet, which was its own kind of noise. She used the time to advance the dinner prep. Delia worked beside her with a focused efficiency that had developed over the course of the morning, and Clara found herself thinking that the girl had good instincts that nobody had bothered to develop. She filed that away somewhere. They heard the shift in the crowd when the ceremony concluded, the release of that formal quiet into something more open and loose, and Clara said, "We have 45 minutes before they come inside for the meal. Tell me where we are on the bread." "Last batch coming out in 10, Delia said. "Temperature?" "Checking." Delia moved to the oven and looked. "Another 8 minutes, maybe." 7, Clara said. "The second oven runs 2 minutes fast. Set your count to 7 and pull on your own judgment, not the clock." Delia nodded. Pete came in at a near run. "They're moving inside. Mrs. Ashford wants the first course out in 30 minutes. "It'll be out in 25, Claire said. "Tell the serving staff to be in position in 15. He went back out. Clara looked around the kitchen, at the sauces, the bread, the plated cold starters already arranged and waiting, the brisket that had been resting at exactly the right temperature for the last 40 minutes, and made a quick internal accounting of every element she was responsible for and where each one stood. Everything was where it needed to be. She let herself feel that for exactly 4 seconds, and then she went back to work. The dinner service ran from 1 o'clock to nearly 3. Food went out in waves, and each wave came back with empty platters, which was its own kind of verdict. Pete and a rotating cast of household staff moved between the kitchen and the dining hall at a pace that felt frantic from the outside, but was, from Claire's position, completely controlled. She'd run larger services than this. She'd run them alone, which this wasn't. The kitchen held. What she did not expect was the quiet that fell in the dining hall around 2 o'clock. Not a bad quiet, a different kind. The kind that happens when people stop talking because they're paying attention to something in front of them. Pete came back through the kitchen door with a look of suppressed excitement that was almost funny on his young face. "What?" Clara said. "The cake," he said. "We brought it out and, ma'am, people stopped talking." Clara turned back to the stove. "Good. Mrs. Hargrove, she's the wife of the county land commissioner. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd seen at a table in 20 years. She said it right out loud in front of everyone." "Did Mrs. Ashford respond?" "She said," Pete paused. "She said thank you and that it had taken considerable planning." Clara stirred the last of the sauce that still needed serving. "All right," she said. "Doesn't that—" Pete stopped himself. "Doesn't that what?" Clara said without heat. "Doesn't it make you angry?" he finished, looking slightly like he expected to be dismissed for asking. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, which surprised him visibly. "But angry doesn't serve the food. Get this out to the left table. They've been waiting longer." He took the platter and went. The moment happened at 2:40. Clara heard it before she understood it. A shift in the sound from the dining hall, a sudden collective stillness followed by a murmur that had a specific quality to it, the quality of people reacting to something unexpected. Ruth came through the kitchen door fast, eyes wide. "What is it?" Clara said. "Someone asked," Ruth said. "Mrs. Hargrove." She stood up and asked directly. She said she'd been asking all afternoon and getting no straight answer, and she wanted to know who the cook was, who actually made this food. Clara set down what she was holding. "Vivian said—" Ruth swallowed. "She said it was a kitchen woman they'd brought in, a widow from out of county. She said—" Ruth stopped. "Say it," Clara said. She said— She held up her glass and she said, "People like her belong in the kitchen. She knows her place." And then she laughed. Ruth's voice had gone flat with something that wasn't quite anger. And some people laughed with her. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara could hear, faintly, the continued sound of the dining hall, the settling back into conversation, the clink of glasses, the particular sound of an incident that had been smoothed over without actually being resolved. She untied her apron. She did it slowly and deliberately, folding it the way she always folded it, the way her mother had taught her, hem to hem, then thirds. She set it on the prep table. "Ma'am?" Delia's voice was uncertain. "Finish the plating on the dessert course," Clara said. "The small pastries go on the left, the fruit on the right, the cream in the center bowl. You've seen it done enough times today that you can do it." "Where are you?" "I need 5 minutes," Clara said. She went to the back of the kitchen, to the small alcove where she'd left her personal bag and her good coat and the wooden case that held her knives. She opened the case and looked at the knives. Her grandmother's boning knife, the chef's knife she'd bought herself 10 years ago with money she'd saved from 6 months of extra baking orders. The paring knife that had needed a new handle twice but cut better than any she'd tried to replace it with. She began wrapping them one by one in the oilcloth she kept them in for travel. She wasn't performing. She wasn't making a point. She was doing the thing that her body was doing because the alternative, going back to that prep table and continuing to work inside those walls after what had just happened in the next room, was not something she had left in her. She had a line. She hadn't known where exactly it was until Vivian Ashford crossed it in front of 200 people, holding a glass and smiling. She had the last knife wrapped and the case latched when she heard the dining hall door. Not the kitchen door. The door between the dining hall and the rear corridor that connected to the kitchen, the one that was supposed to stay closed during service. She heard it open and then close again, and then footsteps in the corridor. Different from Pete's, different from any of the staff. And then the kitchen door opened. Caleb Dawson stood in the doorway. He was still in his formal coat, but the collar was open at the top button, and he looked like a man who had been sitting still for as long as he was capable of, and had stopped being capable. He looked at her, at the folded apron on the table, at the oilcloth knife roll in her hands, at her coat hanging over her arm. He looked at her face, which she was not able to entirely compose in time. "I heard it," he said. "I know. All of it." He didn't move from the doorway. "I was at the far end of the table and I heard every word." Clara said nothing. She held the knife roll and waited. "She stood up and said that," he said, "in front of every person in that room." His voice was controlled in the way voices get when control is costing something. "In front of my neighbors, men I've worked beside for 20 years. She stood up and she said, 'Caleb,'" Clara kept her voice steady, "it's done. I'm going to finish what needs finishing in the next hour, and then I'm going home." "You shouldn't have to—" "What should and shouldn't happen, and what does happen are two different lists," Clara said. "I learned that a long time ago." He looked at her knife roll, at her coat, at her face again. "Don't go yet," he said. "I'm not going this minute. I told Delia to finish the dessert plating, and I need to make sure that she—" "That's not what I mean." He came into the kitchen then, fully in, and stopped about 6 feet from her. "I mean, don't— I need you to wait, before you decide anything. Before you— Caleb, what are you asking me?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been carrying something to the edge of a decision for a long time and had just reached the edge. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. "For what?" "I need to go back in there and do something I should have done before today." He said it in a way that was entirely clear and entirely terrifying in its clarity. "And I need to know you'll still be here when I'm done." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I still have to plate the dessert course," she said. Something in his face shifted. 20 minutes, he said. "Go," she said. He went back through the door. Clara stood in the kitchen with her knife roll in her hands and her coat over her arm and listened to the sound of his footsteps going back down the corridor. And then she set the knife roll on the prep table and she hung her coat back on the hook and she walked over to where Delia was standing at the dessert station with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something they didn't entirely understand. "Small pastries on the left," Clara said. "Fruit on the right, cream in the center." Delia turned back to the table. "Yes, ma'am." They worked. Clara heard the dining hall go quiet about 4 minutes later. Not the ceremony quiet from before. A different quiet, sharper, the kind with an edge to it. The kind that happened when someone said something that nobody in the room had expected. She heard it, and she kept her hands moving because what was happening in that room was happening, and her being still or moving made no difference to it. Then she heard the voices rise, not in laughter this time, in something more confused and urgent, and then a long moment that she couldn't read from this distance. Then she heard a woman's voice, high and sharp, and then Caleb's voice, lower and slower. And then the particular sound of a room full of people who were no longer sure what kind of event they were attending. Pete came through the kitchen door looking like he'd seen something fall out of the sky. "What happened?" Clara said without stopping. Pete stared at her. Mr. Dawson stood up in front of everyone. He swallowed. "He said the feast. All of it. The cake, the bread, everything. He said it was made by one woman, alone, who'd been here for 3 weeks and worked harder than anyone on this property. He said her name." A pause. "He said your name, ma'am." "Clara Whitmore." He said it out loud to the whole room. Clara kept plating the pastries. "And then," she said, "and then he said—" Pete seemed to be searching for the words. "He said he wasn't going to stand in his own house and watch someone be made into a joke. And then he looked at Miss Ashford and he said the engagement was over." The kitchen was absolutely silent except for the sound of Clara's hands on the plates. "He said it like that?" she said. "In those words?" "He said, 'I will not build my life beside someone who measures a person's worth by how they look or where they stand.'" Something like that. Close to that. Pete looked young and shaken, and also, underneath that, like someone who had just watched something he was going to remember for a long time. Miss Ashford left the table. Her father stood up and started talking, and Mr. Dawson he just stood there and waited for him to finish and then said the decision was made. Clara set the last pastry on the last plate. She looked at what she'd made, the full dessert course, complete exactly as she'd planned it, ready to go out. She felt something move through her that she couldn't name precisely. Not triumph, not relief. Something rawer than either of those, something that had been sitting behind her sternum for 3 weeks, waiting for permission to exist. "Get the serving staff," she said. "The dessert course is ready." Pete nodded and went, and Clara stood in the kitchen alone for just a moment, in the particular stillness that follows the breaking of something large. And she breathed, and then she went back to the stove because there was still work left to do. The guests left in stages, the way they always did after something unexpected. Some quickly, with the particular purpose of people who wanted to be the first to tell someone else what they'd seen, and some slowly, in small clusters, talking in low voices with the occasional glance back at the house, as if the building itself might offer clarification. Clara watched none of it. She was in the kitchen breaking down the service, stacking plates, covering what could be saved, disposing of what couldn't, running the sequence of cleanup the way she ran everything, methodically and without wasted motion. Ruth and Delia worked beside her without being asked, which she noted and appreciated without saying so. Pete moved between the dining hall and the kitchen carrying stacked platters, not speaking much, which was the right instinct. The kitchen work had its own mercy. It always did. When everything else in a situation was too large and too tangled to look at directly, there was always the cleaning of the pots and the wiping down of the surfaces and the careful storing of what remained. It was honest work. It didn't ask you to have an opinion about anything except where things went. She heard the Ashford carriage leave at 4:15. She knew the sound of it, had heard it arrive enough times over 3 weeks to recognize the particular weight of it on the gravel, the specific tempo of those horses. It left fast, which told her something, though she didn't spend time working out what. Gerald Ashford's larger wagon followed 20 minutes later. She heard voices before it pulled away. Men's voices, brief and low, and then the crunch of wheels and then quiet. She kept working. At 5:30, when the kitchen was as close to restored as it was going to get tonight, Clara took off her work apron, the second one, the plain one she used for cleanup, and hung it on the hook by the door. She looked around the kitchen one more time, the way you look at a place you've worked hard in and are about to leave. The stove needed a proper cleaning that she'd done most of, but not all of. The prep table was scrubbed. The oven still held some heat. The smell of the day, bread and brisket and caramelized sugar and the specific warm density of a kitchen that had fed 200 people, was already beginning to thin toward cold air and soap. She picked up her coat. "Ma'am." It was Delia from the far end of the table. Are you leaving tonight?" "I'll settle with Mr. Dawson first," Claire said. "Then I'll drive home in the morning when there's light." Delia looked at her with an expression that was mostly composed but had something young and uncertain at the edges of it. "What you did today," she started, and then stopped. "You did good work," Clara said, before the girl could finish whatever she was going to say. "You and Ruth both. You kept up and you paid attention and you didn't fall apart when things moved fast. That's not small." Delia pressed her mouth together briefly. "I want to learn to cook like that someday." "Then find someone who'll actually teach you," Clara said, "not someone who'll just let you watch." She picked up her bag. "Good night, Delia." She went out the side door the way she'd come in every day for 3 weeks, and she stood for a moment in the cold air of the December evening, the sky already dark at this hour, the yard quiet and lit by the pale light coming from the house windows. Then she walked around to the front. Caleb was on the porch. He was sitting in one of the straight-back chairs, with his formal coat still on but the collar fully open now, and he was holding a glass of something she was fairly certain wasn't coffee, and he looked like a man at the end of a very long day, in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. He heard her footsteps and looked up. "I was going to come find you," he said. "I came to settle the payment," Clara said, "and to tell you the kitchen is as clean as I could get it tonight. The oven needs attention in the morning, and there's a crack in the seal on the left burner, that I noticed on the third day. You should have someone look at it before it causes a problem." He looked at her for a moment. "Sit down," he said. "I don't need to—" "Clara, please sit down." She sat in the other chair because arguing about it would take longer than sitting, and she was tired in the specific way that came not from lack of sleep, but from 3 weeks of holding herself at a particular tension that was now suddenly no longer required. He reached into his coat and brought out an envelope and held it out to her. She took it. It was heavier than it should have been for $140. "That's $200, he said. "What was agreed plus 60. The 60 is— it's not enough, but it's what I had on hand." "We agreed 140. You cooked for my fence crew twice out of your own supplies. You ran trials that went beyond the contracted work. You spent 3 weeks in a situation that was—" He stopped. "It's 200. Clara held the envelope. She thought about the mortgage note and the feed and the east fence, and she thought about what $200 instead of 140 meant in practical terms. And she thought that she was too tired to argue about it, and it wouldn't have been the right argument anyway. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked out at the dark yard. "Gerald Ashford told me," he said, "before he left, that I'd made a serious mistake, that I'd sacrificed a significant business arrangement for—" He paused. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "What did you say?" "I said I understood his position." He turned the glass in his hands. "Which is not the same as agreeing with it." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." "He's going to make things difficult," Caleb said. "He has enough reach in this county that he can, not destroy. He can't destroy what my family built here, but he can make things harder than they need to be. Slow down permits, talk to the bank in Sheridan about the credit line." He said it flatly, the way he said most things, stating facts, not asking for sympathy about them. "I knew that before I stood up. I want to be clear about that." Clara looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want you to think it was an impulse," he said. "It wasn't. I'd been sitting at that table for an hour watching. I'd been watching the whole afternoon, actually, every time someone asked about the food, every time Vivian—" He stopped. "And I kept waiting for myself to decide it was not my business, that it was between her and the kitchen staff and nothing to do with me. And then she stood up and said what she said, and I realized—" He stopped again. He wasn't a man who spoke carelessly, and he was working something out in real time, which was unusual for him. "I realized I'd been deciding it wasn't my business because deciding that was easier than the alternative, and easier isn't the same as right." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere out by the barn, one of the horses shifted. "What she said," Clara said, "about women like me not ending up with men like you." He looked at her. "She wasn't wrong," Clara said, "about how the world works. She was wrong about whether that was something to be proud of. But the arithmetic of it, she wasn't wrong." "I'm not interested in the arithmetic," he said. "Caleb, I know what the arithmetic says." His voice was steady. "I've been doing the arithmetic my whole life. Every decision on this ranch is arithmetic. What to plant, what to sell, what to hold on to, when to wait, when to move. And every time I've made a decision based purely on arithmetic, some of them have been right. And some of them I'll be paying for until I'm in the ground." Clara was quiet. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "I need you to understand that. What happened today, I didn't do it so that you'd feel you owed me something. I know that. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because—" He turned the glass in his hands one more time and set it down on the porch rail. "Because I've watched you work for 3 weeks, in my mother's kitchen, and you reminded me of something I'd spent 6 years forgetting." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. "That a person can be themselves," he said, "and that can be enough. Without performing for anyone. Without shrinking or expanding to fit what someone else needs you to be." He looked at her. You were exactly yourself the entire time, even when she was making it as hard as possible to do that. And I hadn't seen anyone do that in a long time." Clara sat with that for a moment. "I wasn't always like that," she said honestly. "I spent a lot of years shrinking." "I know, you told me." He held her eyes. "Which means you decided to stop. That's not a small thing." She looked out at the dark yard and the pale light and thought about the 60-acre ranch and Sophie and the fence post and the window that wouldn't close, and she thought about the woman she'd been when the letter came on a Tuesday and the woman sitting on this porch right now, and whether those two women were the same person who'd just changed her clothes or whether something more significant had happened in between. "I need to go home," she said. "My daughter, I know." He didn't say it to stop her. "I know you do." She stood. He stood. They were standing on the porch in the December dark, and she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and there was a lot in the air between them that neither of them was going to do anything about tonight, because tonight was the wrong time, and they both knew it. "Thank you for what you did today," she said. "Thank you for what you made," he said. "For 3 weeks." She went down the porch steps. "Clara." She turned. "The east fence on your property," he said. "Pete mentioned, when he was talking about you before, he said you'd mentioned it needed work. Pete talks too much." "He does," Caleb agreed. "I'd like to send a crew in the spring, if you'd allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. She walked to her wagon. She drove home in the early morning dark, having slept a few hours in the small room the household staff had given her at the back of the house, and she arrived at her own property as the sky was beginning its first shift toward gray. She sat in the wagon for a moment before getting down, looking at her own house. It was not a grand house. The porch board was still loose. The window she could see from here was still the one that wouldn't close right. The east pasture was invisible in the dark, but she knew the fence was down in 2 places, and the third was leaning. It was her house. She'd built a life in it and lost part of that life in it and continued in it anyway, which was the only thing you could do. She went inside, started a fire, and went to collect Sophie from her neighbor before the sun was fully up. Sophie came home like a small storm, which was how she always came home. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a way of filling a room that Clara had spent 5 years marveling at, and 1 year after Thomas died being grateful for, because a 7-year-old who needed feeding and answering and correcting didn't leave much space for the particular kind of grief that would eat you alive if you let it. "Were the horses very good?" Sophie demanded, dropping her bag by the door. "Did you see a lot of horses? Did you cook for them? Can you cook for horses?" "No," Claire said. "Horses eat grass." Mrs. Fielding's horse ate an apple right out of her hand, and she said it was like being kissed by something very large. "That is an accurate description. I want to learn to do that." Sophie looked up at her mother with the absolute seriousness of a child presenting a reasonable request. "I want to learn everything about horses." "I know you do." "Will we have more horses someday? Better than the 2 we have?" Clara looked at her daughter, at the eyes that were Thomas's, and the chin that was her own mother's, and the particular set of the jaw that was something entirely Sophie. "Yes," she said, "I think we might." Sophie considered this and apparently found it satisfactory, because she moved on immediately to asking about breakfast with the same urgency she brought to everything. Clara made breakfast. She made it in her own kitchen, with the cracked window and the stove that smoked when the wind blew wrong, and she made it the same way she made everything. Paying attention, doing it right, putting something of herself into it, even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. The first letter arrived 11 days after she came home. It was from a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, the county land commissioner's wife, the one who'd asked out loud who made the food, and it was polite and specific and asked whether Clara Whitmore took commissions for private dinners, as Mrs. Hargrove was hosting an important gathering in February and had been unable to stop thinking about a particular pastry she'd eaten at the Dawson wedding celebration. Clara read the letter twice. She wrote back the same day. The second letter came 3 days after that, from a ranching family in the next county who'd heard about the wedding feast from someone who'd heard about it from someone else, and could Mrs. Whitmore come discuss arrangements for a spring gathering of approximately 40 guests. The third letter came from a woman in Sheridan who ran the town's most established boarding house and wanted to discuss a standing weekly arrangement for special dinners. Clara sat at her kitchen table with all 3 letters in front of her and Sophie doing something noisy in the next room, and the loose board on the porch lifting and slapping in the wind, and she thought about what it meant that these letters existed. They existed because she was good. That was the straightforward part. She had always been good, and she had always known she was good, and knowing it and having it mean something in the world were two different things that had not, for most of her life, arrived together. They also existed because Caleb Dawson had stood up in a room full of people and said her name. She held both of those things at once. She didn't let the second one diminish the first, and she didn't let the first one make her pretend the second hadn't mattered. Both were true. That was the honest accounting. She wrote back to all three. Nams. By February, she had more work than she could manage alone, which was a problem she had never had before and which turned out to be a better problem than the ones she was used to. She hired Delia, who had shown up at her door in January with a look of determined uncertainty, and asked if Mrs. Whitmore might need help, and who turned out to be exactly as capable as Clara had assessed her on the day of the wedding, someone with good instincts that had simply never been properly developed. Clara developed them because she knew what it cost to have ability and no one to show you what to do with it. She hired a woman named May, who was older than Clara and had cooked for a mining camp for 6 years and had opinions about spicing that Clara mostly agreed with and occasionally argued about in the productive way that made both of them better. She converted her back storage room into a proper prep space with a second oven she bought with the Hargrove commission money. She fixed the east fence herself in late February, before Caleb's offer of a crew could become necessary, because she needed to do it herself. The window she hired fixed. The porch board she nailed down on a Sunday morning with Sophie standing beside her handing nails with great ceremony, which took 3 times as long as it should have, and was one of the better mornings she'd had in years. Word spread the way word spread in frontier territory. Person to person, story to story, each telling adding something until the story had accumulated enough that it took on its own weight and traveled without needing help. The woman who'd made the Dawson wedding feast. The cook, who'd been told she belonged in the kitchen and had turned the kitchen into the most important room in the territory. The widow from Black Willow, who, depending on who was telling it, had either stood up to Vivian Ashford directly or simply cooked food so extraordinary that it had made the whole affair impossible to ignore. None of the versions were entirely accurate. Clara didn't correct any of them. The truth was in the food, and the food was accurate. By March, she had a waiting list. She saw Caleb twice during those months, both times in town. The first time was at the dry goods store in Black Willow in late January, an encounter so briefly and practically conducted that she almost wondered afterward if she'd imagined the weight of it. He was coming out as she was going in, and they stopped on the steps, and he asked how Sophie was getting on with the recovery from her fever, which had been 2 months ago, and she told him Sophie was fine and had recently befriended one of the neighbor's horses to a degree that was becoming somewhat obsessive, and he smiled, the brief real one that changed his face, and asked about the work, and she told him it was going well, and he said he was glad, and they went their separate ways. That was all. The second time was in late February at the hardware store, where she was ordering the second set of prep table supports, and he was there about some fencing equipment, and they talked for nearly 20 minutes in a way that was completely ordinary and also not ordinary at all. The kind of conversation that existed on 2 levels simultaneously, the surface one about practical things and the underneath one about all the things that were not being said yet because the time for saying them hadn't arrived. She thought about him more than she should have. She was honest with herself about this, which was her policy about most things that were inconvenient. She thought about the way he'd said you were exactly yourself the entire time. She thought about the stool at the end of the prep table and the way he listened and the 3 seconds of the real smile and the fact that he'd stood up in a room full of people who mattered to his livelihood and said her name out loud. She also thought about Gerald Ashford, who had, according to what she'd heard through various people, spent the months since December making things quietly difficult for the Dawson Ranch. Nothing dramatic. Ashford was too calculated for drama. But the kind of persistent low-level interference that required constant management, permit delays, a conversation with the Sheridan Bank, the social pressure that powerful men applied when they felt they'd been publicly embarrassed. Caleb managed it. She heard this from Amos, who had come into town for supplies in late February and stopped by her kitchen door to tell her the fence crew was doing well and that the ranch was holding, and that Mr. Dawson had turned down a buyout offer for the eastern fields that would have solved most of the financial pressure in a single transaction. He said no? Clara asked. Said no, Amos confirmed. Said those fields belonged to this ranch, and they'd stay with it. He turned his hat in his hands in the familiar way. He also said... Amos stopped. What? Said some things are worth more than what they cost you. He looked at her with the careful eyes of a man who'd watched a lot of things over 20 years. I think he was talking about the fields. I'm sure he was, Clara said. Amos looked at her a moment longer than was necessary, and then put his hat on and said goodbye and went back to his wagon. Clara stood in her kitchen doorway and watched him go and thought about things that were worth more than what they cost. She thought about that for a long time. The letter from Caleb came in the 3rd week of March. It was not like his property's first letter, the official cream-colored stationery that had arrived in January and changed everything. This was plain paper, the kind kept in a ranch office desk, and the handwriting was that of a man who wrote with intention and not particularly with elegance, which she found she preferred. He wrote that the ranch was managing well enough. He wrote that Pete had recently demonstrated an unexpected aptitude for baking, having apparently absorbed some things from his time running between the kitchen and the dining hall, and had produced a batch of rolls that were, Caleb's word, decent, which Clara suspected was high praise from him. He wrote that the eastern fields were still his. And then, at the end, he wrote, I find I have things to say that don't fit in a letter. If you're willing, I'd like to come to Black Willow sometime in April when the roads are passable and say them in person. I'm not asking for anything beyond the chance to have that conversation. Whatever you decide afterward is your decision to make. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with Sophie at the other end drawing horses, always horses, on the back of an old flour sack and the stove going steadily behind her, and the window she'd had fixed letting in the thin March light without the draft for the first time in 2 years. She read it twice. Then she got up and found her paper and her pen, and she sat down and wrote back. She told him the roads to Black Willow were passable by the 2nd week of April, in her experience. She told him that she and Sophie would be home most evenings after 5. She told him that if he came on a Thursday, she typically made a venison stew that a man named Amos had described to her in a ranch kitchen 3 months ago, and she'd been making it since, and it was as good as she'd hoped. She told him she had things to say too. She sealed the letter and set it on the corner of the table to go out with the morning post, and Sophie looked up from her horses and said, Who are you writing to? A man named Caleb Dawson, Clara said. Is he nice? Clara thought about a man on a stool at the end of a prep table, listening. About an offer to let her go home to her daughter without counting the cost. About a glass of water on a porch at night. About standing up in front of 200 people and saying a name. He's decent, she said, which was, she thought, exactly the right word. Sophie appeared to find this adequate and went back to her horses, and Clara picked up her pen and turned back to the commission letter she'd been writing before Caleb's arrived, because there was still work to be done, and the work didn't stop for anything. She had learned over the course of a winter that had been harder and stranger and more clarifying than any she'd had in years that this was not something to regret. The work was hers. The kitchen was hers. The 60 acres and the repaired fence and the fixed window and the 2 women she'd hired and the waiting list of people who'd heard her name from someone who'd heard it from someone else. All of it was hers, built by her hands and her attention and the particular thing her grandmother had tried to put into words and never quite managed. Whatever came next would be built the same way. She was sure of that now, in a way she hadn't been sure of much for a long time. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Caleb arrived on a Thursday, as she'd suggested, in the 2nd week of April. Clara heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the back prep room checking the stock she had going for tomorrow's commission, a dinner for 12 out at the Hargrove property, and she came through to the main kitchen and looked out the window and saw him tying up at the post by the gate with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided to be somewhere and was now simply being there. He looked the same as he had in December, which she understood was a foolish thing to notice. 4 months wasn't long enough for a man to look different, but she'd been carrying around her memory of him like a photograph, and photographs were never quite right, and seeing the actual person always required a small recalibration. He was wearing work clothes, not the formal coat from the wedding day. That felt right somehow. She dried her hands and went to the door. He came up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. Roads were good, he said. They usually are by April, she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the late afternoon light, and then she stood aside and said, "Come in. The stew needs another hour, but there's coffee." He came in. He shkiet. The kitchen, when he walked into it, was nothing like his mother's. It was a third of the size, and it had one oven, and the ceiling was lower, and there were two prep tables pushed together along the south wall that were clearly a working arrangement rather than a designed one. And the shelves were full of jars and tins and a collection of equipment that had been accumulated over years rather than purchased all at once. It was also, unmistakably, Clara's kitchen. It had the same quality that his mother's kitchen had carried after 30 years of her working in it. The particular feeling of a space that had been used with intention so many times that the intention had become part of the walls. "You've been busy," he said, looking at the second oven she'd built into the back room, visible through the doorway. "Busy is the word," Clara said, pouring coffee. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table, not at a prep table, and Clara set the coffee in front of him and went back to check the stew, and for a few minutes there was just the sound of a kitchen at work, which was a sound he had come to associate over the course of the past 4 months, with a specific and unreproducible feeling of things being right. Sophie appeared in the doorway from the hall with paint on her hands and a look of frank assessment on her face. "You're the man from the letter," she announced. "I am," Caleb said. "You must be Sophie." "I am," she said in the same tone, and he almost smiled. "Mama said you have horses." "I have several horses." "How many?" "Sophie," Clara said, without turning from the stove. "It's a fair question," Caleb said. He looked at the girl. 14 at present. I had 16 but sold 2 last fall." Sophie processed this. "That's a lot of horses." "It is. I'm going to be a horse doctor," she said. "Not a regular doctor, a horse doctor. Do you think that's a good job?" He looked at her seriously. "I think it's an excellent job. I've needed one more than once, and they're harder to find than they should be." Sophie appeared to find this a satisfactory answer and disappeared back down the hall, presumably to do more painting on more things that weren't supposed to be painted. Clara glanced over her shoulder. "She interrogates everyone." "She's thorough," he said. "That's not a bad quality." "Her father was the same way." She turned back to the stove. "He'd ask you 6 questions before you'd finished answering the first, and somehow all 6 were relevant." He didn't say anything to that. He drank his coffee. "I heard from Amos," Clara said after a moment. "In February. He came through town. He mentioned he'd stopped by. He said the ranch was holding." "It is." Caleb turned the cup in his hands. "Ashford backed off some in March. Not entirely. He's not the kind of man who entirely backs off. But enough. I think he decided the energy was better spent elsewhere." "What changed?" "I made it clear I wasn't going to move on the eastern fields regardless of what pressure he applied. When a man decides a thing is truly not for sale, it changes the calculation." He paused. "Also, the bank in Sheridan got new board members in February. Gerald Ashford's man on that board retired. The new members weren't particularly interested in making things difficult for a ranch that had been a reliable customer for 30 years. That helped. It helped significantly." He said it without drama. "The ranch is fine. It's going to be fine." Clara tasted the stew and made a small adjustment. Amos also told me you turned down the buyout offer for the eastern fields." "I did." "That would have resolved a lot of the financial pressure." "It would have." She turned and looked at him. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because some things are worth more than what they cost you." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "That's what Amos said you said," Clara told him. "He thought you were talking about the fields." "I was talking about the fields," Caleb said, "among other things." Clara looked at him a moment longer and then turned back to the stove because the stew needed her, and because she needed a moment that wasn't his eyes, which were, she had remembered correctly from December, disconcertingly direct. "You said in your letter you had things to say," she said. "I did." "So say them." He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him again, and she found him not uncertain exactly. He was rarely uncertain in the ways most people were, but careful, choosing. "I spent 6 years after Margaret died," he said, being a man who ran a ranch. That was what I was. Not because I decided that was enough, but because I stopped deciding anything about myself at all. I managed what was in front of me and I kept things going and I told myself that was what responsibility looked like. It does look like that, Clara said. Sometimes. Sometimes. Not always. He looked at the table. And then I came into my own kitchen one morning in December and there was a woman there at 4:30 in the morning making broth that had to cook slowly, and she told me cooking was half chemistry and half theater, and He stopped. I sat on that stool and I listened to you talk about your grandmother and your daughter and the sound a pie crust makes when it's right, and I thought, this is what I've been missing. Not you specifically, not then. I didn't know you then, but whatever this was, someone being entirely themselves and it being... He searched for the word. Enough. Just enough. No performance. No management. Clara stood at the stove and listened. And then I got to know you over 3 weeks, he said, and it became specific. It was you. He said it simply. And I watched what happened on that day, and I did what I did, and you left, and I spent 4 months. I've spent 4 months wondering if I handled all of it wrong. If I moved too fast or too slow or said the wrong things, if what I felt was real or just... He made a gesture that acknowledged the inadequacy of what he was about to say. Gratitude or admiration or something that looked like more than it was. And, Clara said, and it's real, he said. I'm not a man who says things he isn't sure of. I don't have it in me to sit in front of you and say something I haven't examined from every direction. He looked up at her. I'm sure. Clara was quiet. She was thinking about the woman who had opened a letter on a Tuesday, 2 years after her husband died, and read the words $140 and felt the particular shame of needing something that badly. She was thinking about driving to a ranch and using the side entrance and tying her apron and deciding that the job was just the job, that she was there to cook and nothing else would happen and nothing else would matter. She was thinking about how wrong she had been and how glad she was to have been that particular kind of wrong. I have a 60-acre ranch, she said, that barely broke even last year, even with the new work. I have a daughter who is going to require a horse of her own within the year, by the look of things. And I don't know where that's coming from. I have 2 women working for me who depend on the work continuing. I have a waiting list and no guarantee it stays full. She looked at him steadily. I'm not a woman who needs to be rescued. I need you to understand that before any of this goes further. I know that. I'm not saying it to be difficult. I'm saying it because the last time someone looked at me like they wanted to help me, it came attached to a set of conditions I didn't understand until I was already in the middle of them. I'm not Vivian Ashford, he said. No, she said. You're not. But I've spent a long time being what someone else needed me to be, and I'm done with that. And whoever is in my life going forward needs to understand that what they're getting is what's actually here. Not a managed version, not a smaller version. She held his eyes. I'm not small, Caleb, in any sense of the word. He looked at her with complete steadiness. I know, he said. That's the point. The stew made a small sound on the stove, and Clara turned and adjusted the heat and stood for a moment with her back to him, looking at the pot. Stay for dinner, she said. I was hoping to. And we'll talk more after Sophie goes to bed. All right. And she stopped, started again. And I think you should come back, not just today. I think you should come back and we should take the time it takes to figure out what this is without either of us rushing it, because we're afraid it'll disappear if we don't hold it down. He was quiet for a moment. That's the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in 4 months, he said. I'm a reasonable person, Clara said. When I'm not being stubborn. How often are you not being stubborn? She almost smiled. It varies. At dinner was the venison stew she'd learned from Amos's description of Ellen's recipe, which she'd made a dozen times since January and had now adjusted to her own hand. More pepper than Ellen apparently used, less salt, a particular moment in the cooking where she added a splash of something dark that she'd never written down because it was a feel thing and couldn't be transcribed. Sophie ate 2 bowls and talked without stopping about the horse doctor career and also about a crow that had been coming to the back fence every morning for 2 weeks, and that she had named Captain because of how it walked. Caleb listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he'd given Clara in the kitchen at Dawson Ranch. Genuine, not performed, and answered Sophie's questions without talking down to her, which Clara noted and which was, she thought, not a small thing. A man who took a 7-year-old seriously was a man with a particular kind of character that you couldn't fake over the course of an evening. When Sophie had been put to bed, a process that required negotiation about the crow and a promise that yes, eventually, they would look into whether crows could be trained, though Clara privately had no idea where to start with that. Clara came back to the kitchen and made tea and sat across the table from Caleb, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours, not about the ranch or the business or Gerald Ashford or the East Fence or any of the practical things that would need to be discussed eventually. They talked about Thomas, her husband, who had been funny in the way that caught you off guard and who had never once made her feel like too much, and about Margaret, his wife, who had apparently been the most organized person he'd ever known, and who had kept the ranch's accounts with a precision that he still tried to match, and still couldn't. They talked about what it was like to love someone and then not have them, and about how that changed the way you moved through the world, more careful in some ways, less patient in others, permanently aware of how quickly the ordinary became the past tense. I stopped cooking for a while, Claire said, after Thomas. Not entirely. I had to eat, Sophie had to eat, but I stopped cooking the way I usually did. I just made things that kept us alive and didn't put any of myself into it. How long? About 6 months. And then one day I made a pie. I don't even remember why. I think someone brought apples by and it seemed wasteful not to. And I was standing at the stove and I realized I'd been humming. I hadn't hummed in 6 months. She looked at the table. And I thought, okay, so that's still there. And I just kept going from there. Caleb looked at her. What's the pie? What? What kind of pie? She looked up. Apple. Obviously. With cinnamon? And a little nutmeg. And the crust has to be a specific thickness, or it doesn't... She stopped. He was almost smiling. What? Nothing, he said. I'm going to think about that pie for a long time. I'll make it for you sometime, she said, before she'd quite decided to. The almost smile became the real one, the brief one that changed everything. And Clara looked away because even now, even after 4 months of knowing what that smile meant, it was still a lot to look at directly. He came back 2 weeks later, and then 2 weeks after that. And then once a week through May, sometimes twice, the ride between Dawson Ranch and Black Willow becoming a route he knew well enough to do in the early dark. Sophie started asking, with the forthright arithmetic of a child, when Mr. Dawson was coming next, and then started asking why he left each time, and then started asking, with the particular pointed innocence that children deploy when they know exactly what they're doing, whether he might stay for breakfast sometime since he was always there for dinner. Sophie, Clara said. I'm just asking, Sophie said. I know what you're asking. Sophie maintained a look of complete guilelessness that convinced no one. Caleb, when Clara told him about this later, did not appear to find it embarrassing. He appeared to find it, in fact, somewhat settling. The way a man might find it settling when the complicated question he's been holding gets asked out loud by someone too young to understand why it was supposed to be complicated. She's not wrong, he said. It's a long ride to make and then turn around. It's the same ride back, Claire said. You've been doing it for 6 weeks. I have. He looked at her. I don't mind the ride. I mind the turning around. Claire said nothing for a moment. This is going to be complicated, she said. Not between us, but the practical... I know. I can't move the work to the ranch. The clients are here, in this county, and I've spent 6 months building those relationships. And Delia and May depend on... Clara. He said it the way he sometimes said her name, the way that wasn't sharp or soft, but just direct, a line from him to her. I'm not asking you to move anything. I'm not asking you to rearrange what you've built. He paused. But I'd like to stop turning around. She looked at him for a long time. Ask me properly, she said. Don't let me infer it. Something moved through his expression, a flicker of something that might have been nerves, which she had not seen on him before, and which made him look suddenly more human than usual. Will you marry me? he said. Not a grand speech, not the performed version of the question, just the words, said plainly, by a man who meant them. Clara thought about a letter that had come on a Tuesday, about the side entrance and the folded apron and the knife roll wrapped in oilcloth, about the stool at the end of the prep table and a man who listened to her talk about pie crust and paid attention in the way of someone who had learned what inattention cost. She thought about what it had taken, the full accounting of it, all the months and the humiliation and the work and the terrifying morning she'd started packing her knives to arrive at this kitchen, this table, this question. She thought about her grandmother, who had said cooking was half chemistry and half theater, and who had also said once, near the end of her life, that the most important thing a person could do was refuse to believe the small version of themselves that other people needed them to be. Yes, Clara said, not easily, not without the weight of what it meant, but clearly without qualification, which was the only way she knew how to say anything that mattered. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in her kitchen in the May evening light with the stove going, and Sophie asleep down the hall. And neither of them said anything for a while, because some things didn't need words put on them right away. They were married in August, on the land that was Clara's, not at Dawson Ranch, which Caleb had offered and which she'd declined, politely and finally, not at a church or a courthouse. On the 60 acres that she'd nearly lost and had held on to and had worked until it meant something again, on the flat ground near the east fence she'd repaired herself in February with her own hands on a cold morning. It was not a large wedding. It was not supposed to be a large wedding. Amos came because when Clara had written to invite him, he'd written back with more words than she'd ever received from him in their entire acquaintance. And he arrived with his hat in his hands and looked at her with eyes that said something about Ellen that he would never say out loud, and she understood it and was grateful for it. Pete came, looking older than he had in December somehow, more settled in himself, and he brought the roles he'd been practicing, which were, Clara had to admit privately, genuinely decent, and set them on the food table with the careful pride of someone who'd worked hard at something and was offering it as a gift. Delia and May were there. Mrs. Hargrove came, to Clara's surprise, and brought her husband, the land commissioner, who shook Caleb's hand with the particular warmth of a man who had known him a long time and was pleased about something. Sophie stood beside her mother in a dress she had agreed to wear only after extracting a promise about the crow, which had apparently been successfully trained to come when called, and which Sophie considered a major personal achievement. There was no grand ceremony. There was a justice of the peace from Black Willow named Walter Pruitt, who was 63 years old and had officiated enough weddings to have stripped everything unnecessary from his portion of it. And he said the words that needed saying, and Caleb and Clara said the words that needed saying, and that was that. Then there was food. Of course there was food. This was Clara's wedding and Clara's land and Clara's table, and the food was the best thing she had ever made, which was saying something, because she had spent her whole life making things worth eating. She had been up since 3, which was not unusual. She had stood in her own kitchen in the August dark and made the things she'd been planning for a month, not to impress anyone, not to perform for anyone, but because this was how she marked occasions that mattered, with her hands and her attention and the full weight of what she knew about feeding people. The venison stew was there, because it was Amos's, and it was Ellen's, and it was right. The apple pie was there, so 3 of them, because 1 was never enough. And Caleb saw them when the table was laid and looked at her with an expression that she thought she would remember for the rest of her life. The bread was there, with cinnamon that you couldn't quite taste, but that made the kitchen smell like something good was happening. There were the savory tarts she'd first made for the Dawson wedding feast, which felt like the right kind of circle to close. There were things she'd made only for today and would never write down, because some things needed to stay in the moment they were made for. People ate and talked, and Amos had 2 bowls of stew, and Pete ate 4 pieces of bread and looked guilty about none of it. And Sophie appointed herself the person responsible for making sure everyone had tried everything at least once, which was a job she performed with significant authority. At some point in the late afternoon, Clara stood at the edge of her own land and looked at what was in front of her. The people at the table, the August light, the east fence she'd repaired, the house with the window that finally closed properly. And she thought about the woman she'd been when she drove to Dawson Ranch in November with 4 crates in the back of her wagon, and told herself it was just a kitchen job. She had not known then what she was going toward. Nobody ever did. That was the part that people forgot when they looked back at the difficult stretches of their lives. They forgot that going through them felt like exactly what it was, which was hard and uncertain and often humiliating, not like the first chapter of something that was going to come good. You couldn't see the shape of it while you were inside it. What she knew now, standing on her own land in August, was something she hadn't known in November, or rather something she'd known and then forgotten and had to find again the hard way. She was worth the space she took up, not because Caleb Dawson had said so, not because the waiting list was full, or because Mrs. Hargrove had said her name to the right people, or because 200 guests had eaten her food and stopped talking when the cake came out. She was worth the space she took up because she had always been, and the only thing that had ever been in question was whether she was going to believe it. That was the thing about worth. It didn't arrive from outside. People spent their lives waiting for someone to hand it to them. The right husband, the right job, the right amount of recognition from the right people. And while they waited, they made themselves smaller and quieter and more apologetic. And they called it humility when it was actually something else. Something more like fear. She had been afraid. She was not going to pretend she hadn't been. The fear of being seen and found lacking was a real thing, and it had a real weight, and it had shaped years of her life in ways that still showed in how she moved and what she said, and the particular way she braced herself when she walked into a room full of people who didn't know her yet. But fear was not the same as truth, and the truth was, she knew how to make things. She knew how to feed people in the way that went beyond keeping them alive. She knew how to take what she had, flour, lard, time, attention, the recipes in her muscle memory, and the ones her grandmother had given her and the ones she'd invented herself over 30 years of practice, and turn it into something that made a person feel, for the duration of a meal, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, a very large thing, and the people who had made her feel otherwise had been wrong, and she had learned in the end to let them be wrong without letting it be her truth. Caleb came and stood beside her at the edge of the land and didn't say anything, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him, his understanding of when silence was the right language. After a while she said, "Your mother's kitchen." "What about it?" "I want to work in it again. Not permanently. My work is here the way we discussed, but I want to. There are things I was planning to do with that kitchen in December that I didn't get to finish." He looked at her. "You were planning things with the kitchen." "I had ideas for the layout of the second prep surface. The angle was wrong, and the cold storage is on the wrong side of the building. It should be north-facing, not east." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to renovate my mother's kitchen?" "I want to make it work better," Clara said. "It's a great kitchen. It could be a better one." She would have argued with you about the cold storage. She'd have been right to. We'd have figured it out eventually. Clara looked at the field in front of her. I think she'd have liked the argument. He considered this. She would have, he agreed. She liked people who had opinions they could back up. I have opinions. I've noticed, he said, which was so dry that it took her a second, and then she laughed, genuinely, the kind that came from the same place as the laugh in the kitchen in December when he'd asked if Sophie was better than the rolls. He put his arm around her, and they stood there on her 60 acres in the August light, while behind them, the table full of people who'd shown up for this ate and talked, and Sophie's voice rose above everything else periodically, with the authority of a child who was absolutely certain of her place in any gathering. In the years that followed, and there were many of them, more than either of them could have mapped from the edge of that August field, the things that lasted were not the things that would have seemed most significant from the outside. The waiting list became a business with a name, which Delia suggested and Clara resisted and then accepted when she realized she'd been spending 3 weeks arguing about something she actually agreed with. May stayed, Delia stayed, and learned more in 2 years than most cooks learned in 10, and began eventually to make things that Clara tasted and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Where did you learn that?" And Delia would say, "From you," and Clara would say, "I never taught you that," and Delia would say, "I know. I figured it out from watching," which was, Clara thought, the best possible thing a teacher could hear. Pete turned out to have not just an aptitude for baking, but an actual gift for it, which became apparent slowly and then suddenly in the way gifts usually did, and Clara spent 2 winters teaching him by correspondence, letters back and forth with recipes that were more instruction than recipe, questions that were more specific than he knew how to ask yet, but would be exactly right in a year. And when he was 22, he opened a small bakery in Black Willow that smelled on good mornings like something good was happening. And the first time Clara walked past it and smelled that smell, she stopped on the sidewalk and felt something that took her a moment to identify. Pride. The specific kind that had nothing to do with herself. Gerald Ashford receded, the way men like him receded when they found other things to pursue. His pressure on the Dawson Ranch had never been about the land, not really. It had been about winning a particular contest, and when it became clear the contest was over, the interest dissolved. The eastern fields stayed with the ranch. The springs kept flowing. The grazing stayed good. Caleb was not an easy man to be married to, and Clara was honest with herself about this. He carried things alone for longer than was necessary before he'd share them, a habit from 6 years of having nobody to share with. He made decisions quickly and changed them slowly, which was a combination that required patience. He was wrong sometimes with complete confidence, which was the most maddening version of being wrong, and the process of helping him see it without making him defensive was work she hadn't anticipated and had to develop a method for. He was also the person she wanted to tell things to first, which she hadn't had in 2 years before him and had missed more than she'd let herself know. He was the person who noticed when she was tired before she'd admitted it and didn't say you should rest, which she would have rejected, but simply showed up in the kitchen and started washing whatever needed washing without being asked. He was the person who remembered, without prompting, that the stew needed to start before noon or it wouldn't be right by dinner, and started it on the mornings she was running a commission out of county, and left the kitchen clean when he was done. These were small things. She'd learned to pay attention to small things. Sophie got her horse the following spring, a gray mare she named Compass for reasons that were entirely her own logic, and that she explained at length to anyone who stood still long enough. She also, over the course of the following decade, became exactly what she had announced she intended to become at 7 years old, by a route that involved a great deal of stubborn reading and 2 years studying with a veterinarian in Cheyenne and returning to Black Willow with a competence that matched her confidence, which had never been in short supply. Clara attended the first day Sophie opened her practice, which was in a converted outbuilding on the 60-acre property, now expanded, now solvent, now genuinely thriving. And she stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter and thought about Thomas, who had the same eyes, and about what he would have thought of this particular moment, and she thought, he would have said, I told you she was stubborn enough to do anything she wanted, which was the highest compliment he knew. She missed him. She had always missed him, and she would always miss him. And that was not a failure of the life she'd built since. It was just true, the way certain true things were permanent fixtures rather than things you resolved. Caleb knew about the missing. She'd told him plainly in the way she told him things, directly without dressing it up. And he'd said, I know, and he'd meant it, because he knew about missing too. It was one of the things they held in common that they'd each rather not have, and holding it together was different from holding it alone, even if it was still the same weight. There was a morning, years in, that Clara would think about sometimes when she was trying to explain something to herself about the shape of a life. It was an ordinary morning in October. Her kitchen, the one she'd rebuilt twice by then, and that now had a north-facing cold storage and a prep surface at the angle she'd known was right. She was starting bread, the same bread she'd been making since she was 12, the kind with the cinnamon that you couldn't taste but that changed the air. And Caleb was at the table with coffee and a ledger he was working through, and Sophie was at the fence with Compass doing whatever Sophie and Compass did in the early morning, and Delia was coming in at 7 for the day's commission work. Clara was shaping the dough, and she realized she was humming. She had been humming, she thought, for about 20 minutes without noticing. She stood at her prep table in her own kitchen on a Wednesday morning in October, and she was humming over bread dough, and her daughter was outside with her horse, and the man at her kitchen table looked up from the ledger when she stopped and said, Don't stop. I didn't know I was doing it, she said. You do it when the dough is right, he said. I've noticed. She looked at him. She thought about everything it had taken, The full accounting, all the years and the loss and the humiliation and the work and the long way around to this kitchen on this morning. And she thought that there was no version of it she would want to have gone faster or easier, because every specific hard thing had been the thing that had moved her forward. And forward was where she was standing now, in a kitchen that was hers, making bread that was hers, humming because the dough was right. She turned back to the bread and kept her hands moving. "The cinnamon's the trick," she said. "You can't taste it, but it makes the whole room smell like something good is happening." "I know," Caleb said. "Your grandmother was right." "She usually was," Clara said. She shaped the last loaf and covered them to rise, and she looked at what she'd made. 12 loaves in a row, imperfect and real, and exactly enough. And she felt, in the entirely ordinary October morning, the particular quiet that comes not from nothing happening, but from being exactly where you are supposed to be. Not because someone put you there, because you walked there yourself, one hard step at a time, and you stayed. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was the truth she'd spent a long time learning and would probably spend the rest of her life remembering. You stayed. When it was hard, and when you were tired, and when the voices, inside and outside both, told you that you were too much or not enough, or the wrong shape entirely, you stayed in your own life, and you kept making the things you knew how to make. And eventually, if you were honest and you were stubborn and you paid attention, the room started smelling like something good was happening. And then you kept going from there. These were small things. She'd learned to pay attention to small things. Sophie got her horse the following spring, a gray mare she named Compass for reasons that were entirely her own logic, and that she explained at length to anyone who stood still long enough. She also, over the course of the following decade, became exactly what she had announced she intended to become at 7 years old, by a route that involved a great deal of stubborn reading and 2 years studying with a veterinarian in Cheyenne, and returning to Black Willow with a competence that matched her confidence, which had never been in short supply. Clara attended the first day Sophie opened her practice, which was in a converted outbuilding on the 60-acre property, now expanded, now solvent, now genuinely thriving. And she stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter and thought about Thomas, who had the same eyes, and about what he would have thought of this particular moment. And she thought, he would have said, "I told you she was stubborn enough to do anything she wanted," which was the highest compliment he knew. She missed him. She had always missed him, and she would always miss him, and that was not a failure of the life she'd built since. It was just true, the way certain true things were permanent fixtures rather than things you resolved. Caleb knew about the missing. She'd told him plainly, in the way she told him things, directly, without dressing it up. And he'd said, "I know," and he'd meant it, because he knew about missing too. It was one of the things they held in common that they'd each rather not have, and holding it together was different from holding it alone, even if it was still the same weight. But there was a morning, years in, that Clara would think about sometimes when she was trying to explain something to herself about the shape of a life. It was an ordinary morning in October. Her kitchen, the one she'd rebuilt twice by then, and that now had a north-facing cold storage and a prep surface at the angle she'd known was right. She was starting bread, the same bread she'd been making since she was 12, the kind with the cinnamon that you couldn't taste but that changed the air. And Caleb was at the table with coffee and a ledger he was working through, and Sophie was at the fence with Compass doing whatever Sophie and Compass did in the early morning, and Delia was coming in at 7 for the day's commission work. Clara was shaping the dough, and she realized she was humming. She had been humming, she thought, for about 20 minutes without noticing. She stood at her prep table in her own kitchen on a Wednesday morning in October, and she was humming over bread dough, and her daughter was outside with her horse, and the man at her kitchen table looked up from the ledger when she stopped and said, "Don't stop." "I didn't know I was doing it," she said. "You do it when the dough is right," he said. "I've noticed." She looked at him. She thought about everything it had taken, the full accounting, all the years and the loss and the humiliation and the work and the long way around to this kitchen on this morning, and she thought that there was no version of it she would want to have gone faster or easier, because every specific hard thing had been the thing that had moved her forward, and forward was where she was standing now, in a kitchen that was hers, making bread that was hers, humming because the dough was right. She turned back to the bread and kept her hands moving. The cinnamon's the trick, she said. You can't taste it, but it makes the whole room smell like something good is happening. I know, Caleb said. Your grandmother was right. She usually was, Clara said. She shaped the last loaf and covered them to rise, and she looked at what she'd made, 12 loaves in a row, imperfect and real and exactly enough. And she felt, in the entirely ordinary October morning, the particular quiet that comes not from nothing happening, but from being exactly where you are supposed to be. Not because someone put you there, because you walked there yourself, one hard step at a time, and you stayed. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was the truth she'd spent a long time learning and would probably spend the rest of her life remembering. You stayed. When it was hard, and when you were tired, and when the voices, inside and outside both, told you that you were too much or not enough, or the wrong shape entirely, you stayed in your own life and you kept making the things you knew how to make. And eventually, if you were honest and you were stubborn and you paid attention, the room started smelling like something good was happening. And then you kept going from there.